the deer panteth for the water, so my soul longs after thee. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee. You alone are my strength, my shield. To you alone may my spirit yield. You alone are my heart's desire, and I long to worship thee.
So, dear friends, we shall now continue to reflect on the next major judge, the story of Ehud, narrated in chapter 3 of the book of Judges. In his case too, we will find all the 7 steps or stages that we mentioned about the narrative pattern that is found in the narrative about the major judges are found here too. And in the story we read, the people of Israel again committed sins. They forgot Yahweh, went after other gods and so on. And the Moabite king Eglon comes to attack them. It is the work of Yahweh himself. And this is the story that we find in the rest of chapter 3. And when the people were taken captives and they served King Eglon, then they began to cry out. And when they cried out for 18 years, Yahweh now comes to their rescue. Okay, sometimes you may ask, why did God wait for 18 years? The usual interpretation is that God takes his own time because he wants to teach the people a lesson. When they went after other gods, it was a great ingratitude. And when they forgot Yahweh, it was again a very serious sin from their part. And hence, they are to suffer the punishment for such sins. And that's the reason why Yahweh takes time to intervene. It is not because that Yahweh has no love for them. It is precisely because Yahweh has love for them that he punishes them in this way. As we have already seen, punishment in the Bible is always meant to bring one back to God himself. And therefore, here we can say, through Ehud, God is trying to bring the people back to himself and make them aware that they have done something wrong and that is not to be allowed and that will not be tolerated. And therefore this is the rest of the story in chapter 4. And finally God strengthens him and he fights against enemies, conquers them, and then he administers justice for some time. And towards the end of the chapter, in verse 3, in 31 of chapter 3, there we find the story of one of the minor judges, the first that we find in the book of Judges, Shamgar. And only one verse is given to him, and it is implied that he also saved Israel. And that is what is written here. He too delivered Israel. And he fought against the Philistines and won a crucial war against them, and so on. Therefore, this is the way how we can understand about the minor judges. No much details are given about them, but we can imagine that they too played a very serious, important role for the deliverance of Israel. Okay, now we go to chapter 4 and 5. There we find the story of two people, Deborah, a prophetess, and Barak, a chosen man or the judge. But both are combined in all the narratives about them. And the reason, practically, Barak was chosen, but he was afraid. And he wanted to have the help of Deborah. And now Deborah comes to help him, and together they defeat the enemy. But as it was warned to him earlier, glory is given to Deborah more than Barak in a way. But that doesn't matter. For God and his cause, they were ready to surrender their lives, give their lives as a sacrifice, and God was pleased with them, and God saved them. It is in that way we are to understand about it. And therefore we find the combined or the story of the leaders who had a combined effort to drive out the enemy. And here we find Deborah is the only woman deliverer in the history of the judges. And her story is given in chapter 4 in the prose form, and in chapter 5 in poetry or in poem. And therefore, this poem or the hymn, it comes from an ancient time. Usually it is said to be from the 12th century. And therefore, it is very important to note that she was acclaimed by all the people at that time. And that is what is the meaning of this. And therefore, we find the story of Deborah and Barak is narrated in chapters 4 and 5. And she was a very wise woman, and hence we find she chose some military strategy, and it was for the great advantage and benefit of Israel, and that is how she won the war. And we will find it narrated in the chapters here, and we'll find there will be the army of Israel and also the army of the tribes, and the also the army of the enemy, Sisera. And Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the troops who were with him. And they came to the Wadi of Kishon, and the river Kishon practically was not full of water at that time. But then what happens? Deborah said to Barak in verse 14, "For this is the day on which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. The Lord is indeed going out before you." So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with the 10,000 warriors following him. And 10,000 would means an innumerable number. We can just think in that way. And the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his army into a panic before Barak. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot, while Barak pursued the chariots and the army, and all the army of Sisera fell by the sword. And we'll find the story also is interpreted in this way. When Sisera had come with all the chariots, suddenly there was rain and the small river began to overflow. And because of the rain and also the flood water, the entire area where the chariots of Sisera were placed or employed, it became very marshy or muddy, with the result that the chariots got stuck in the mud and they could not be used for the war. And therefore, the soldiers of Sisera fled before Israel because they were depending on the might of their chariots, but now they are unable to use the chariots, and hence they come to realize that they cannot defeat the people of Israel, and hence they tried to escape, but they were chased and killed by Israelites. Therefore, we see here again the work of the Lord. It is the Lord who gives them victory, and this aspect is always emphasized in the wars fought by the judges. Therefore, this is what we can see. And Yahweh thus is working again a miracle in favor of his people Israel. That's what in summary we can speak of it. Okay. And when we think of the war, we can have some personal thoughts too. Whenever there is a war, there will be victims too. Okay, take any war in the present day or in the past, there will be always the victims. And now it is a question to ask ourselves, am I really a victim of any war or an agent of war? Agent of war would mean one who causes, one who fights the war. And therefore, am I an agent or am I a victim? And the answer or the course of action to be taken is clear. If I am the agent, I have to stop the war. If I am the victim, I should trust in the Lord and pray that God's will be accomplished and that we may be saved. And we can see God's work or God's blessing is showered upon the people of Israel. Okay, now we go to in chapter 5, we can also find one more point for reflection. Defeat in war means God is offended and he has turned away from the people of Israel. And once they realize, they have to come back to Yahweh, otherwise they will be doomed. And in personal life, we can say there is a war going on between the positives and negatives in my life. And it is a personal battle. On one side, we are called to be true to Yahweh, faithful to Yahweh, and to be obedient to Him. And on the other, we find just the opposite, to be disobedient to Him. And actually, we are to be careful about this situation. We are destined to be obedient, and then Yahweh will protect us, save us. Therefore, that is the personal message from chapter 5. And now we go to chapter 6, and there we find the situation of the people of Israel fell into the negative again, and God sends the Midianites to punish Israel. And that story that we find in chapter 6, the story, it is also the story of the judge Gideon. We know in the introductory part we read, God punishes the people of Israel for their infidelity, and natural catastrophic phenomenon may be seen as the punishment given by God. It could be invasion by the enemy, then famine that comes into the land, or an earthquake which occurs and destroys the entire area. And therefore, all these are typically some of the catastrophic phenomena which occur in the life of the people. And these are interpreted as God's punishment steps, or God is punishing through these His people, and we are to be careful about it. And this is what we find in the introductory session. And now we find the story of the call of Gideon. And we can say this call is almost similar to the call of the prophets. And it has got all these elements too. The call begins with the God. He takes initiative. And when the call is given and also the mission is entrusted, Gideon says, I cannot do it. I am unable. Even though it is said that he was a very good warrior, now he becomes afraid. And God's reassuring words are given to him. And therefore, just like the prophets, God is reassuring the prophet, or here the judge, and he will be able to defeat the enemy. And that is the assurance given by God. And when Gideon is called in this way, we find something interesting. He wanted to test. The angel of the Lord has come to him to call him. And now he wanted to test who exactly is this angel, his identity and his power and so on. He wanted to know whether he is really the angel of God and so on. And therefore, he is in a way trying to test him. And the test made by Gideon are twofold. And it is interesting to note that he is trying to test the power of God, something usually unheard of. But the test is allowed by God, and that's what we find there. And here we find Gideon is asking God to give him a special sign. And it is a story narrated in verse 36 to 40 in chapter 6. Gideon said to God, in order to see whether you will deliver Israel by my hand, as you have said, I am going to lay a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on the ground, then I can know you will deliver Israel by my hand. Then it happened to be like that. Then in verse 39, he speaks again to God. Do not let your anger burn against me. Let me speak one more time. Let me please make trial with the fleece just one more. Let it be dry only on the fleece, and on all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night. It was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. And when this story is narrated, what do we understand from it? Can we trust God? Sometimes it happens in our lives. We also are tempted to test God, like Gideon. Lord, if you love me, if you care for me, give me this, give me that, or take care of me, or give me this job, take away this sickness. All kinds of demands we make before the Lord. This is actually a test of the Lord. And this test is to be understood in this particular way. God is so big to accept our testing, even if He may not give us what we demand, but He will give in His time, and that is what is important. God is big enough to undergo our test, and God has His own ways, and therefore we are to accept the situation as it is, and we are not to go on testing God continuously. But the test is practically there, and we are not to be worried about it. But at the same time, we can say the test is giving us the courage to go forward and also to strengthen ourselves. That is what we can say. And that biblical text also gives us this message. We are to challenge ourselves to trust in God without testing. Real trust of love, or we can say real test of love, is to trust without testing. And if that is there, then I will be always one who is accepted by the Lord, we can say. And now we go to chapter 7. And there we find Gideon is asked to take the leadership to defeat the Midianites. And there were many people, more than 30,000, gathered together to fight with them. But God said, this is too many. And He sent out 20,000, still 10,000 with Him. And then God said, okay, send them out. And there were only a few thousands or few hundreds. And then Gideon is asked to lead them to the river. And they were thirsty, and they were asked to drink water from the river. And most of them knelt down and took water in their hands and drank it. And what is the advantage? They can see, since they are kneeling down, they can see whether the enemies are coming to attack or not meanwhile. And therefore they were able to look at them in that way. And hence we see there were many who did it. But some people, a few hundreds, and practically about 300 of them. They just went to the water and began to lap up water with their tongue, just as the dogs or the other animals do. And what is the symbolism of this? These people, practically, they are least careless. Whether the enemy come to attack or not doesn't matter. They are concerned with their own affair. And it is such hopeless people, we can say. They are least concerned about the war or consequence, and they are not at all concerned with their safety, security. They forget everything and just to do what they could do at that time. And it is such people uh, who are meant by this simile, we can say. And therefore, these people who drink water by their tongues, practically they have no preoccupations of anything. They are least good for fighting because they are not concerned and they do not look around. Therefore, least good for fighting. And that's what we can say. And they are irresponsible and they do not have the control of their senses. All these things can be said about them. But others who kneel down and drink, as we explained, they were courageous and they wanted to be alert so that if the enemy comes while they drink water, they'll be ready to fight back. But the case of the other ones was not like it. And now is the irony. What does God say? You choose these 300. Practically, these 300 good for nothing people. And I will win the war over Midianites using them. And that is the assurance or guarantee given by Yahweh. And hence we can see they were chosen to fight together with Gideon. And that's the story we find in chapter 7. And when he was going to attack the Midianite camp by himself and his armor bearer, then they happened to hear about a dream which one of the soldiers had and the interpretation that they had given for the dream. And what is the dream? He saw a small piece of barley bread. It came down from heaven, but when it fell down on a big tent, the tent collapsed. It was overturned. And the interpretation was given like this. The small piece of barley bread would mean it is the people of Israel. They are so small compared to other people, other countries. And hence, now what will happen? Just as a small piece of barley bread that destroyed the tent, the same way, the people of Israel will destroy the Midianites and their army. And that is the message given through the story. And we find the same thing happens later. And the capture of the Midianites was practically interpreted in a very solemn way. The 300 people, they were given jars. Gideon divided them into three groups, and he gave earthen jars for each one, and he also gave trumpets to each one, and in the jar was placed the piece of okay, there was also the fire kept in the jar, or we can say just like the fire which is used by the people to show, to see the place and so on. And when in the middle of the night, it is said after the second watch, and at that time, the people, the sentries or the people or soldiers keeping watch, they had just changed their position. And at that time, Gideon asked the 300 people to stand all around the camp of the Midianites. And then he asked them, "You do what I say and what I do." And then he blew the trumpet and broke the jar that he had with him, the earthen vessel, and everybody took up the fire in their hands, and they began to shout for Gideon, for Yahweh and for Gideon. Of course, we know primary place is for Yahweh. And when they shouted, the people, they began to be in panic because they thought they are totally surrounded by the enemy. Because all around the camp, the people are blowing trumpet and also the fire is seen. And now the people in the camp of Midianites, they thought we are lost, and they began to flee away. And then the people of Israel, they chased them and caught them and killed them. And another thing, when the Israelites come into the camp, the 300, they find something still strange. The Midianites are fighting among themselves. One fights with another one of the same camp. Thus, there was an utter confusion, and they were not able to win the war. They miserably lost. Israel won the war, and that is how he defeated Midianites and became a deliverer for the people of Israel. Therefore, this is the story that we will find in chapter 7 and chapter 8. And in chapter 8, we find the people approach him and ask him to be their king, but he refused to, saying, Yahweh is our king, and it should not be questioned by anyone. And in chapter 9, we find another important story, and there we see the story narrated in detail. Gideon had 70 sons in different wives, and he had also a concubine in whom he had another son called Abimelech. And now we see Abimelech, he killed all the sons of Gideon, his own brothers, and except one, the youngest one called Jotham, he managed to escape from the great slaughter. The story of Jotham that we find in chapter 9, we will analyze in the next session because it takes a few more minutes. Therefore, we will analyze it in the next session. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lord, for the gift and love of your sacred word. Open our hearts to put into practice that which you have revealed to us through your word. Amen.